Welcome to Seneca Lake Mysteries, the podcast where we explore the unusual, strange, and unexplained on New York's largest Finger Lake. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone truly for listening to episode 1, sharing it, all the feedback and comments and words of support. I was optimistic that it would be well received, but the response was way, way beyond what I expected. And now that I've seen how many of you are out there that are interested in these stories of the unusual and anomalous around Seneca Lake, I'm even more excited to keep sharing and collecting and sharing these kinds of stories. So again, thank you so much. And if you want to support Seneca Lake Mysteries, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts and share it far and wide. Also, please subscribe to the email list by heading over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com, and you'll be the first to know when new podcasts are released, along with all other Seneca Lake Mysteries related news. I'm lining up some great guests for future podcasts, and I'm always looking for more. If you have a story you'd like to share, or if you're an investigator of the unexplained or have knowledge or expertise on the topics we cover or other unusual topics related to the Seneca Lake area, no matter how unorthodox or esoteric or bizarre, please email podcast@SenecaLakeMysteries.com or leave a voicemail at 607-307-1167. Now keep in mind, if you want to tell your story but don't want to be identified on the podcast, you can tell me your story and I'll relay it while preserving your full anonymity. You can also contact me if you have any feedback or suggestions or complaints or comments or questions or whatever by emailing, again, podcast@SenecaLakeMysteries.com or leaving a voicemail at 607-307-1167. Now, here's what we've got for this episode. Up first, we've got the all-time champion of Seneca Lake Monster stories, the 1900 encounter with the steamboat Otetiani. If you haven't heard it before, buckle up, and if you have, there's never a bad time to hear it again. Then we've got what I consider the top contender for the second best Seneca Lake Monster story ever, one that I call the Blacksmith and the Giant Eel. Next, we're off to the year 1968 when a surge of UFO sightings took place across the Finger Lakes and around Seneca, including one stunning encounter on County Road 23, not far from the lake. This UFO flap has been pretty well documented, but we'll take a closer look at how some of the witnesses dealt with the aftermath of their incredible experiences in the following years in a story called Autumn of '68, the Mud Lake Road Incident. And finally, we'll sift through some incredible forgotten history from the northern end of Seneca Lake. We'll look at discoveries of giant skeletons, mysterious burials, and tales of visiting giants in a story I call Giants of Geneva. So let's get to it. On July 17th, 1900, a sidewheel steamboat, the Otetiani, crowded with passengers, including city officials and wealthy local businessmen, along with a Canadian geologist, was on its way from Watkins Glen to Geneva. Around 7 p.m., about halfway to its destination, the Otetiani encountered a 25-foot serpentine creature in the lake. Now, there have been numerous essays and articles, videos, and podcasts dedicated to the Otetiani Lake Monster story. An independent documentary from 2016, Exploring Seneca, recounts the Otetiani story in great detail. So the story's been told many times, but it couldn't hurt for me to tell it one more time for those of you who may not have heard it yet, or if you've heard it, hear it one more time. I call this one the Steamer-Serpent Showdown. It was a few minutes before 7 p.m. and the passenger steamboat Otetiani was about halfway between Dresden and Willard on the way to Geneva. The pilot, Frederick Rose, called out to the captain, Carlton C. Herendeen, to alert him to what appeared to be an overturned boat in the water about 400 yards ahead. The captain took a look through his glass at what he assumed was a floating boat and described it as about 25 feet long, widest and highest in the middle, with a sharp bow and a long, narrow stern. Meanwhile, a group of passengers made their way over to Frederick Rose and the Otetiani's pilot house to discuss the mysterious abandoned overturned 25-foot boat that was floating alone in Seneca Lake. But this wasn't a group of ordinary passengers. Instead, it included some of the most influential and powerful men in the city of Geneva, as well as a geologist from Canada. So on the Otetiani that night, gathered together and wondering about the lonely boat in the water, were the following Geneva residents: F.A. Mallet, president of the Board of Public Works and editor-publisher of the Saturday Review; Albert L. Fowler, the Commissioner of Public Works; D.W. Hallenbeck, also Commissioner of Public Works; George C. Schell, the Police Commissioner; and Fred S. Bronson, the manager of the Geneva Telephone Company. And one other passenger of note was Professor George R. Elwood of Guelph, Ontario, who was a geologist. So as the men hung around the pilot house, speculating about the upturned boat, Captain Herendeen was signaling to the engineer to slow their approach. When the Otetiani was within about 100 yards, the crew swung the davits outward to lower a boat into the lake so they could approach the overturned boat. And suddenly, what they presumed was the abandoned vessel turned and began moving away from the steamboat. Captain Herendeen shouted full speed ahead, and the Otetiani began chasing the slow-moving object. As the steamer quickly gained on its target, the crew and passengers of the Otetiani got another surprise. The object turned toward the steamboat, suddenly lifted its head above the surface, looked directly toward the Otetiani, and opened its mouth to show off 2 rows of sharp white teeth. Captain Herendeen needed to make another decision, and quickly. He decided that the best course of action would be to violently ram the creature in order to wound it, and then take it back to Geneva alive. If the serpent ended up dying, it would still create quite a stir when they brought the carcass to land. The Otetiani turned so that it would hit the serpent from the side. When the passengers crowded on the deck to get a view of the showdown between the steamer and the serpent, Captain Herendeen ordered them to move to the middle of the boat in case the creature attempted to get on board after being attacked. Then the captain further instructed the passengers to grab a flotation device and to try to stay calm, because even the crew was unsure how this lake monster would respond to unprovoked violence. Understandably, the captain's orders didn't inspire confidence in a lot of the passengers. Some of them were so upset they started crying before taking refuge in the steamboat's cabin, which is not surprising. And I know I'd be pretty wigged out by the visions of a giant, bleeding, angry water lizard jumping onto the boat to extract his revenge. Then the Otetiani made one last turn to take aim at the creature, and the captain called out full speed ahead, and the assault commenced. But as the steamboat rapidly approached, the serpent abruptly raised its head and stared down the Otetiani again before sinking into the lake. As the steamboat churned over the spot where the monster had just been, a few passengers reported looking at the water and seeing the dark outline of the creature passing by just below the surface. So at this point, the captain made another decision, which was probably his best decision of the day so far. And rather than engage in a potentially lengthy and risky game of chicken with the lake monster, Herendeen told the crew to point the ship towards Geneva to complete the scheduled trip. Even though he wasn't able to capture the monster, he probably figured at least the people on the Otetiani that night would have a wild story to tell about their rendezvous with the elusive water beast on a Tuesday night summer steamboat trip. And then from the afterdeck, a woman declared, "There it is. The thing has come up." Captain Herendeen rushed to the stern of the Otetiani, followed by the passengers, and they all looked out to see the serpent lying in nearly the same position that it was earlier like an overturned boat drifting on the waves. And once again, Carlton Heron Dean needed to make a quick decision. Should he just continue the trip and leave the Serpent alone, or should he try to injure or kill it again? And the captain chose violence. This time, however, the steamboat was maneuvered so that the huge paddle wheel on the starboard side of the boat would slam into the creature about halfway between its head and tail. Full speed ahead. Somehow, the lake creature didn't even see the steamboat coming, so when the Otetiani hit the beast, a loud thud was heard as those on board were thrown off their feet, and the steamer was careening wildly, but eventually the crew regained control and righted the vessel. The passengers and crew paused silently for a few moments. The only sound was the boat's engine, and then some cheers and some screams came from the stunned crowd. And floating, badly injured, next to the Otetiani was the Seneca Lake Monster. It had a gaping wound in its side. The serpent again raised its head, but this time it took one last breath and gasped before going motionless. They had killed the Seneca Lake serpent. Some of the observers on the boat understandably speculated that the death was due to a broken spinal column. So just as he had planned, Captain Herondine sent his crew to secure the carcass and hoist it onto the steamboat to take to Geneva. They lowered the lifeboats, they rowed over to the creature's side, and then they tied ropes around the body. The crew and the passengers then joined together to pull the ropes to raise the body from the water. But at the moment the dead giant serpent cleared the surface of the lake, one of the ropes slipped off and the tail dropped back into the water. So the sudden weight on the other rope was too much for the passengers and crew's hands to handle, and faced with the choice of either letting go of the rope or being pulled into the lake with the dead monster, the rope was released and the Seneca Lake Monster slowly submerged and disappeared. And notably, the carcass had sunk into one of the deepest areas of Seneca Lake at more than 500 feet. The Otetiani got to Geneva shortly before midnight, and while many of the stories being recounted by the passengers were similar in most of the details, there was some variation in their descriptions. So the passenger who was considered to be the most trustworthy and credible of all the witnesses was the Canadian professor, George R. Elwood, a geologist by trade. And Elwood was able to inspect the carcass quite closely, as he was one of the volunteers who rowed out in the lifeboats and tied ropes around the dead lake serpent. And Professor Elwood concluded that the mysterious creature was a Clydastes, a marine lizard believed to have become extinct approximately 66 million years ago. Elwood estimated the length to be 25 feet and the weight around 1,000 pounds, with a long tail that tapered before broadening at the end like a whale's tail. Elwood said the head was triangular with a long mouth containing 2 rows of sharp triangular white teeth, similar to the teeth of a sperm whale. The body was covered with a greenish-brown material reminiscent of a turtle shell. It also had unblinking round eyes, kind of like a fish, according to the professor. And when the rope slipped and the carcass slid back into the lake, Professor Elwood was able to see that the creature's belly was a cream white color. Now, this story of the Steamer-Serpent Showdown was not only published in local newspapers, but it ended up being picked up nationally, and the story gained a lot of notoriety around the country for a short period of time. And after its incredible rendezvous with the Seneca Lake Serpent in 1900, the Otetiani continued regular routes between Geneva and Watkins Glen through late 1905, and for the next 3 years, it was only intermittently in service. And then when the steamboat reached the end of its useful life, it wasn't simply disassembled for parts. Instead, the Otetiani was brought ashore, cut in half, and began the next phase of its life as a hen house. So now that we've covered the legendary meeting between the Otetiani and the Seneca Lake Monster, I want to tell another story. And this one's from the same era, actually approximately a year prior to the Otetiani encounter. And I really love this story. I think it's just as colorful and epic as the Otetiani story in its own way. And I call this one The Blacksmith and the Giant Eel. George Sorner was a blacksmith who lived on the shore of Pine Bay on the west side of the lake, about 17 miles south of Geneva. George loved catching and eating fresh perch and pickerel from Seneca Lake and had set a gill net in the water on the evening of Thursday, July 13th, 1899. The next morning, George found a large hole torn in the net. The damage seemed to have been caused by a large animal that had become entangled in the net before breaking away. So George repaired the net and set it in the lake again that night. And the next morning, the net was in even worse condition than the day before. So the story of the blacksmith and the mysterious net-destroying lake monster spread quickly throughout the surrounding community, with each retelling taking on new details. So some folks said it was a manatee, others said it was a dugong, while others claimed it was a hippopotamus with 100 teeth as sharp as swords. So, unsurprisingly, George Sorner felt uneasy. Of all the sea serpent stories he'd ever heard, none of them involved the beasts appearing twice in the same place. George's neighbors saw that he needed support, so they agreed to give him a hand, and they decided that George would stand guard and watch the gill net all night, and if the monster returned, George would fire his pistol to signal to the neighbors of the creature's reappearance, who would then come and help him. So on the evening of July 15th, 1899, George set a new, stronger gill net in Seneca Lake, then took position in the stern of his boat, grasping an edge of the net in one hand to detect any movement. Now he just needed to stay awake through the night until the morning. George's vigil was interrupted, though, by a skin-soaking downpour in the early morning, but he kept on alert, and shortly before sunrise, for the third time in 3 nights, the creature came back. George felt something violently strike the net. He immediately drew and raised his pistol and fired a warning shot into the air to notify the neighbors. But he didn't just sit around and wait for backup. As he quickly rowed his boat out towards the disturbance in the water, a long, smooth, slate-colored body surfaced from the water and moved quickly past his boat before retreating below the lake's surface. He drew his pistol up again, fired 4 more warning shots to let his neighbors know they needed to hurry up. And within minutes, Pine Bay was dotted with boats coming to George Sorner's assistance, with each vessel carrying a farmer, a shotgun, and a fish spear. And as the disturbance in the water kind of subsided, the boaters noticed that a long snake-like creature was entangled in George's net. So 2 of the farmers each grabbed an end of the net and slowly raised the serpent out of the water. At that moment, 5 shotguns rang out, riddling the creature with bullets nearly from head to tail, and it turned out to be a very large eel. One member of the sea creature hunting party, a Robert William Sellers, stated that the eel was 13 feet long. So in case you're wondering, as of this writing, the longest known freshwater eel on Earth is the European conger, which can grow to just under 10 feet in length. And the longest saltwater eel ever recorded in history was a 13-foot-long, slender giant moray. And unfortunately, it's unknown what happened to the bullet-riddled corpse of Seneca Lake's world record-sized giant eel. So back in 1968, the Finger Lakes experienced one of the largest UFO flaps in the area's history, with a surge of sightings across the region. While this rash of UFO reports has been documented before, I'd like to present some additional information that has been overlooked, which tells the story of the aftermath of the UFO flap and how it affected the numerous witnesses, especially those around Seneca Lake. And I call this story Autumn of '68, the Mud Lake Road Incident. So on Thursday, October 17th, 1968, around 10 p.m., John Franklin was traveling east on Mud Lake Road on his way to Watkins Glen after passing through the village of Tyrone. John was a husband and a father in his 40s who worked as a industrial equipment salesman for a local company, and he was en route to his home in the eastern Finger Lakes and was on track to arrive there within about an hour. So as John was driving on this very rural road, roughly 7 miles from Watkins Glen, suddenly a brilliant floating white light caught his attention as it approached his car from behind. The object began to hover in complete silence about 2 stories above the ground over the car, and suddenly the vehicle came to a halt and everything shut off. The motor, the radio, the lights all went off. And for the next 5 minutes, John remained in the driver's seat and watched as this blinding light changed from white to an orange-red color and a blinding green. He was terrified. He was unable to discern any size or shape to the object due to the overpowering brightness, but he was also too frightened to lean out the window or exit the car to get a closer look at the object. And eventually, the object moved southwest toward Tyrone, at which point the car's engine and lights and radio all came back on. So John was completely rattled and decided he was going to drive directly to the sheriff's office in Watkins Glen to report the event. So when Mr. Franklin got to the sheriff's office, he was met by Deputy Sheriff Robert Reed, who said that when John arrived, he appeared to be shaken, but, quote, he wasn't drunk or acting as though he wanted publicity. He didn't ask for a police investigation. He just thought that the incident should be reported. So that's exactly what John did. He recounted the entire harrowing story to Deputy Sheriff Alex Cole, stating, quote, laugh if you want to, but I was so scared and shook up I did not know what to do, end quote. After John left the sheriff's office, he resumed his drive home, and Deputy Cole drove to the location of the sighting, but said that he found no evidence of a UFO visit. The next day, John Franklin received what was most likely an unexpected phone call from a reporter at the Ithaca Journal, who asked him to comment on his UFO encounter from the previous night. Now, although John had communicated very clearly with the sheriff's office that he wasn't seeking any attention, the local news media had somehow already gotten word of his statements to the deputies within 24 hours. John Franklin gave the journalist a very short statement saying, quote, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want publicity. The next day, October 19th, newspapers in Ithaca and Watkins Glen published the details of John Franklin's encounter. They also published his full name, his home address, his age, and his occupation. So because he felt a duty to notify the proper authorities after a terrifying and bizarre experience on a rural road, his private life was laid bare and his reputation became publicly associated with a controversial and often ridiculed subject. But the following couple of months brought several more dramatic sightings around the same area of the Mud Lake Road incident. A little over a month after John Franklin's experience, on Monday, November 26, 1968, a man was doing chores on his farm in the town of Reading around 6:30 p.m., around twilight. The farm was located around 2 miles northwest of the area of Mud Lake Road where John had seen the UFO. When the farmer's 3 children saw a bright light hovering in the night sky west of their farm, he grabbed his binoculars to take a closer look. He watched as the object changed colors from green to yellow, red, and white. without making any sound. He then phoned his relatives who lived about 4 miles north near Rock Stream, who also began watching the same silent, motionless light in the sky. He also called the Schuyler County Sheriff's Department, and Deputy Alex Cole, who had assisted John Franklin at the sheriff's office just a few weeks earlier, was dispatched to the farm. Deputy Cole also observed the hovering object, although strangely, Cole said that he didn't see the light change colors. Instead, it just appeared black and white to him. The object remained in the sky for around a half an hour, although it's unclear on whether it flew away or just disappeared. Then, a little over 2 weeks later, on December 12, 1968, around 5:30 p.m., a fuel and feed business operator from Dundee was driving his delivery truck south on Van Dyke Road in Reading, heading towards Mud Lake Road. He saw something in the distance that he thought at first was an airplane. Then he realized that the object had no red or green wing lights that a plane would have, and it was a brilliant, constant, circular light he described as mammoth. He believed that it was around 6 to 8 feet wide, was moving from west to east, and traveling roughly along the same path as County Line Road, which is also known as Mud Lake Road. And this object appeared approximately 3.5 miles from where John Franklin had his encounter. For several minutes, the man watched the object as he drove approximately 2 miles south on Van Dyke Road when the light suddenly vanished. And according to the man, quote, as though it became aware it was being watched, it shut off. It didn't fade or fly away behind clouds. It shut off like someone flipped a switch. But first, it shot down a flat beam of light toward the ground. The next day, Barbara Bell, a reporter from the Ithaca Times, interviewed the man about the Van Dyke Road sighting. And after asking around the neighborhood of County Line Road to see if anyone else saw the same object, Bell found a second witness. And this was a 15-year-old boy who was driving a tractor in a field nearby when he saw an extremely bright cluster of lights in the sky. He started driving toward the farm owner's home to alert them, but the lights, quote, turned off suddenly, end quote. And the entire sighting lasted about 10 seconds, and neither witness knew about the other until Barbara Bell came, investigated, and then wrote about the incident in the evening paper. Now, Bell's article also revealed a second witness describing an unusual illuminated object in the sky over Mud Lake Road in roughly the same location and time as John Franklin's encounter. A woman, along with her teenage daughter, from their home on Upper Glen Road, had witnessed numerous anomalous lights hovering in the sky at night in the fall of 1968. And they carefully wrote down the date, time, and details of each sighting. And although the shape and size of the object weren't discernible due to the distance from the woman's home, all of them made no sound, and some performed maneuvers that would be impossible for any known aircraft. Among all these sightings the woman's daughter had observed an unidentified light in the sky in the vicinity of Mud Lake Road on the same night and time as John Franklin's encounter. So it's very interesting to notice that John Franklin made his report in October. Apparently, the deputy sheriffs there were laughing at him, if we take that from his quote, when he said, "Laugh if you want." And it turns out that he wasn't alone in seeing these lights in the sky. So winter settled in, the new year arrived, and media reports of UFO sightings dwindled. Months and years passed, and the Finger Lakes UFO flap of 1968 kind of faded into memory. Then, in November 1977, the iconic UFO contact film Close Encounters of the Third Kind began what would end up being a 6-month theatrical run, and it elevated the subject of UFOs to a pop culture phenomenon. By March of 1978, NBC had a TV show called Project UFO, which was loosely based on the United States Air Force investigations into the UFO phenomenon, and Project UFO was a bona fide Friday night television hit. So the Ithaca Journal decided it was a good time to revisit the spate of unexplained objects in the local skies 10 years earlier. Ithaca's Close Encounters was the name of the article that was published in the Inside section of the Ithaca Journal on Saturday, March 4th, 1978. The reporter was Judith Horstman, who would go on to become an award-winning journalist, a Washington correspondent, an author, and a professor. And Horstman explained the newspaper's renewed interest in the UFO wave of 1968 and the response from the witnesses they contacted. Horstman said, quote, "We wondered about what the passage of 10 years had done to the impact of the local encounters on the people who saw them during the UFO flap here and how it changed them. We didn't have much luck in finding out. Many were unreachable. 4 of them were unwilling to talk. 2 of them pleaded with us not to use their names. 1 threatened to sue us. I can't face the loss of credibility," one man said. "Please don't bring that up again. That's all in the past. My family went through hell over that," a woman told us. "If I had known what was going to happen, I never would have said anything about it. I was harassed. It was really embarrassing. I'm sorry I ever talked to anybody about it, and I never will again." End quote. Now, Judith Horstman did manage to find some people who were willing to have their names, photos, and interviews published. There were 2 witnesses, an investigator, and a skeptic that were all quoted in the article. There was, however, 1 witness who declined to comment, but the Ithaca Journal went ahead and republished details of that sighting anyway. And that was John Franklin's story. Once again, it was back in the local news, with the Ithaca Journal again publishing his full name and the town where he continued to work and reside with his family. And because of the similarities between Close Encounters of the Third Kind and John's experience, it seems that the newspaper felt that his story needed to be publicly retold regardless of whether or not he agreed to speak with their reporters. The Journal contacted John by telephone for an interview, and he gave what they called a polite but firm response. "I don't want to discuss it," he said, and hung up. Now, it's unclear if the Ithaca Journal tried to contact the witnesses that I mentioned earlier that all had sightings in the Mud Lake Road area, and if they were among the witnesses who expressed a strong displeasure with the paper contacting them. But regardless, I decided to either not use their names or use pseudonyms for all the witnesses from 1968, including John Franklin. That's not his real name, as it's impossible to know if they or their families would want their names and stories put out there again decades later. Of course, all their names are readily available to anyone who wants to read the original news articles. I'm just choosing to not put them out there. Now, it's been well over a half century since the autumn of 1968, and there hasn't been another wave of UFO sightings in the Seneca Lake area that have generated as much local media interest. But this doesn't mean that there are no more UFOs being seen. Today, most local law enforcement offices won't take UFO reports from witnesses. So if you see a UFO, you call the police or the sheriffs. They'll tell you that's something we don't handle. And it's more or less the same with local media outlets. They won't take interest in a sighting generally unless there are multiple witnesses in multiple locations. So instead, these days, witnesses are able to report their sightings anonymously to organizations like the National UFO Reporting Center and the Mutual UFO Network, who have collected and investigated dozens of reports over the decades of anomalous aerial objects seen above and around the lake. Also, the stigma attached to being a UFO witness isn't as intense as it was in the late 1960s, with an estimated 40% of Americans believing in UFOs currently. But there still is a stigma, whether people are reporting UFOs or Bigfoot or ghosts or a spiritual or mystical experience. or any other kind of unexplained phenomena. And this is something that I acknowledge and I keep in mind with the Seneca Lake Mysteries project. So anyone who wants to contact me and share their story about experiencing something that isn't supposed to be, quote, real. And in many cases, these kinds of experiences can be transformative for people. And in my opinion, these types of stories are important in helping all of us understand the nature of reality and the nature of life itself. Of course, it's good to be skeptical and seek a prosaic explanation, but still, people have been having these kinds of experiences for millennia throughout all known human history, and I believe they are perfectly natural parts of the human experience. Although some people don't agree with that, so they laugh, they mock, they ridicule, and in doing so, they strongly discourage people from sharing these fascinating and important stories. So here at Seneca Lake Mysteries, I always keep John Franklin's experience in the back of my mind, respecting confidentiality and allowing people to share these incredible stories without fear of repercussions or shame. So after I released the first episode of the podcast, a longtime follower of Seneca Lake Mysteries, Jason Lamphere, reached out to me and said he had an unusual story and wanted to know if it was something I'd heard about. I told him to send it along, and he sent me a clipping from an 1873 book entitled History and Directory of Yates County, which included a story about something very intriguing that was found near Cayuga Lake, which lies roughly 8 to 10 miles to the west of Seneca Lake. And here's what the clipping said. Quote, "There was an Indian burial ground on the west shore where large quantities of human bones were interred in a mound of conical shape, on the top of which grew an oak tree, 18 inches in diameter. Many of the skeletons were judged by Dr. William Cornwell and others to have belonged to a very large and stalwart men, some of them nearly 7 feet tall." And it turns out this topic is something that I have been looking into, not only legends of giant skeletons being found in the vicinity of Seneca Lake, but also stories about ancient Indian mounds and ceremonial earthworks in the area. Still, I was very interested to hear this story about these skeletons being found west of Seneca Lake near Cayuga Lake, because I had also uncovered a story of giant skeletons being found about 8 to 10 miles to the east of Seneca Lake in the town of Fayette near Cayuga Lake. Now, this story was published in a 1900 book entitled Centennial Historical Sketch of the Town of Fayette, Seneca County, New York. After describing an ancient earthwork in the area, which they referred to as an Indian fortification, it was an embankment of earth that formed a circle covering several acres of land, about 4 to 5 feet high, and about 4 feet in thickness at the bottom and 3 feet thick at the top, with gateways or openings in the embankment 5 feet or more in width, with large stones placed to protect the embankment on the sides of the openings, and a moat or ditch that had been dug around the outside of the earthwork. And after that description comes these tantalizing details. Quote, "An ancient Indian burying ground was also found located nearly a mile southeast of this fortification, where human skeletons of unusually large size were found in mounds of earth. These were regarded by many persons as the bones of a prehistoric race of human beings." Now, this is a story that I was planning on doing in a later podcast, as I had planned to kind of work my way up to some of the more bizarre or fringe kind of stories like this one. But after Jason reached out to me, I decided, hey, why not do this story in the second episode? So that's what I'm going to do. And this one is called Giants of Geneva. Now, this story begins at the location of the former Haudenosaunee Seneca village known as White Springs, located at the corner of modern-day Preemption Road and White Springs Lane in Geneva, and where the White Springs Manor is currently located. The village of White Springs, which has a Haudenosaunee name, but I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to try, but it's spelled Ganechstage. If anyone out there knows how to pronounce that, please let me know for future reference. So the village of White Springs was there from roughly 1688 to 1732. 5,000 people lived there, likely drawn by the clear water springs that were on the site that ended up supplying water to the city of Geneva in later years. And also, I'm not going to get into the long history of the Seneca and Haudenosaunee people in the area, but in 1732, the residents of White Springs moved to another location called New White Springs, just a few miles southwest. And then later, they moved to what was referred to as the capital of the Seneca Nation, Gunundasaga, which is located at the top of what is now Castle Street in Geneva, roughly where the Cornell Agritech campus now stands. So back to White Springs, after the Seneca people left, the land had a series of owners, and in 1839, it was purchased by a man named Gideon Lee. Now, this site had numerous burial mounds. It's unclear of the number, but suffice to say there were many, many burial mounds around this village site. And in 1842, Gideon Lee decided that the land would be more valuable with these mounds removed, so he undertook a large project to grade all the mounds and flatten the land on White Springs Farm. Now, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this kind of undertaking, essentially destroying the graves of dozens, if not hundreds of people, would be akin today to taking a bulldozer into your local cemetery, digging up the ground, and sifting through the dirt for artifacts, and then either keeping the artifacts for yourself or disposing of them. Now imagine taking bulldozers into cemeteries all across the continental United States, destroying sacred spaces and the final resting places of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to read you a passage from a book called The 14th Annual Report, 1909, of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. And this excerpt describes the grading of the mounds at White Springs Farm in 1842. Quote, "When the grounds were graded in 1842, numerous traces of the old Indian occupations were found. In a lane opposite the site of the old carriage house now occupied by a later building and near a tulip tree, which is probably the tulip tree still standing, there was a burial mound about 3 feet high, from which many skeletons were exhumed. Another burial mound was located a short distance south of the one above mentioned, and west of and in front of the mansion, from 1/4 to 1/3 of the distance from the road to the house. This knoll was about 4 feet high and yielded many skeletons. As the bottom of the ossuary was not reached in the grading, there are doubtless bones of the, quote, first families, end quote, still interred there. There are in the lawn gentle elevations of ground which strongly indicate other burial places. Inquiry years ago among citizens conversant with the work and the workmen themselves elicited many interesting facts about these sites. Most of the bones taken from them appeared to have been those of adults and of a good-sized race. In 1 or 2 instances, they were of extraordinary size. It is estimated that 4 or 5 wagon loads of bones and skulls, perhaps more, were removed, deposited in low places in the neighborhood, and covered up. Some degree of order appears to have been observed by the Indians in making these burials. Some of the bodies were buried in a sitting position and covered with a sandy loam brought from a distance, the natural formation at that point being a gravelly clay soil." End quote. Now, obviously, the mention of skeletons of an extraordinary size is compelling enough, but I was also intrigued by the mention of some of the bodies being found buried in a sitting position and covered with a sandy loam, a type of soil that was not naturally found in the vicinity of the White Springs farm, which was naturally a gravelly clay soil. So now we take a look at a document that came from the National Park Service, dated January 28th, 2021, entitled Notice of Inventory Completion, Geneva Historical Society, Geneva, New York. Now, in more recent years, the United States government has worked with museums, historical societies, and other entities to return native artifacts or bones to the appropriate tribes. So this document isn't particularly unusual. There's many, many similar documents in existence. And in this case, the Geneva Historical Society worked with the Seneca Nation to assess the remains and various artifacts they had in their possession. And for this particular case, I want to read the section called History and Description of the Remains. Quote, in the spring of 1969, human remains representing, at minimum, one individual were removed from Reed Farm in Ontario County, New York. Two boys, James and Thomas Reed, discovered the human remains in a sand mound 8 miles south of Geneva, New York, along Seneca Lake. They found the remains of one individual, possibly female, buried in a seated position with crossed arms and crossed legs and facing east. In May 1969, the Reed family placed the human remains on loan with the Geneva Historical Society, and since 1995, the human remains have been under the Society's control. No known individuals were identified. No associated funerary objects were present. A written description of the burial at the time of discovery stated that no artifacts were discovered with the human remains. In 1995, Peter Jemison, NAGPRA coordinator for the Seneca Nation of Indians, opined that the human remains were of prehistoric date, as a Haudenosaunee burial would have included a beaded necklace. Along the eastern shore of Seneca Lake, seasonal settlements established for fishing marked the periphery of Seneca Nation territory. A few miles to the west of these settlements, archaeological evidence exists for the associated Seneca towns. Based on the totality of the information, the Geneva Historical Society has determined that the human remains listed in this notice are ancestral to the Seneca people. So I find this very interesting for several reasons. One, the representative of the Seneca Nation essentially said that this was not a Haudenosaunee burial, and therefore not likely to be the remains of someone from the Seneca Nation, even though the Geneva Historical Society had determined that the remains were ancestral to the Seneca people. It's pretty clear that the person who was found in this burial mound was not from the Seneca Nation. They were from this period prior to the Seneca people living in the area. And also it's very interesting that the human remains were found in a sand mound, and the individual was buried in a seated position with crossed arms and crossed legs facing east, not unlike the remains that were found at the White Springs site of people buried in a seated position and covered with sand or a sandy loam, which is just a soil that's heavy in sand. And considering it was determined that the remains found on the Reed farm was not someone from the Seneca Nation, that opens up the possibility that the remains that were found buried in an almost identical manner at the White Springs farm were also from the era prior to the Seneca people living there. And this would also indicate that people were living at the White Springs site long before 1688 when the Seneca people lived there. Now we're going to travel from the White Springs site about 2 miles north along a perfectly straight stretch of County Road 6, also known as Preemption Road, to the location of what is likely one of the oldest human-made structures in the town of Geneva, the mound at Ganundasaga. Over the years, the mound has greatly diminished in size due to numerous excavations by government and academic archaeologists over time, plus the routine looting of the site by local residents in days past. But amazingly, the mound is still here, After hundreds, maybe thousands of burial mounds were wiped from existence across the landscape of New York State, the mound at Canandaigua has survived. Lying behind a gas station and marked by a monument that was donated by the landowners, the mound continues to be a significant and important historical, cultural, and spiritual site for the Seneca people. Again, it's not as big as it used to be, but it's still here, just like the Seneca people are still here. And there is an account written in the 1800s that is possibly the original story told by the Seneca people of how the mound came to be. And why do I say possibly? Because it's important to know the author when reading native stories and history. It's said that many anthropologists and researchers, especially those in the 1800s, weren't always reliable narrators of native history and would often interpret those stories to reflect their own beliefs or biases. So the story of the Canandaigua Mound was written by renowned anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan in his book League of the Iroquois, which was considered groundbreaking when it was published in 1851. Morgan was one of the first European Americans to study and document the social structure, customs, and history of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which consists of the Oneida, Onondaga, Mohawk, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora nations. However, Morgan has been criticized by Native scholars and researchers for what they see as his biased approach, which often led to the interpretation of Haudenosaunee social structures and cultural practices from a European point of view, which could lead to misunderstandings and misrepresentations of Native American cultures. And today, Morgan's reputation among anthropologists is complex, as his contributions to the field were important and historic, but his recountings of some details are questionable. So keep that in mind when considering Lewis Henry Morgan's telling of the story of the Canandaigua Mound. And here's what he said. Quote, "There is an interesting tradition connected with this burial mound. The Senecas say that once they had a protector, a mighty giant taller than the tallest trees, who split the largest hickory for his bow and used pine trees for his arrows. He once wandered west to the Mississippi, and from thence east again to the sea. Returning homeward over the mountains along the Hudson, he saw a great bird on the water, flapping its wings as if it wished to get out. So he waded in and lifted it on the land. He then saw on it a number of men who appeared dreadfully frightened and made signs to him to put them back again. He did so, and they gave him a sword and a musket with powder and balls and showed him how to use them, after which the bird swam off, and he saw it no more. Having returned to the Senecas at Canandaigua, he exhibited to them the wonderful implements of destruction and fired the gun before them. They were exceedingly terrified at the report and reproached him for bringing such terrible things among them and told him to take them away again, for they would be the destruction of the Indians, and he was an enemy to their nation who had brought them there. Much grieved at their reproaches, he left the council, taking the dreadful weapons with him, and lay down in a field. The next morning he was found, from some mysterious case, dead, and this mound was raised over his body where he lay. It is averred by the Onondagas that if the mound should be opened, a skeleton of supernatural size would be found underneath." End quote. So if we assume that this story is accurately told by Morgan, it would seem that due to the Senecas at Canandaigua having never seen a gun or a sword before, that this story predates the arrival of Europeans and their firearms in the 1600s, as well as the founding of Canandaigua as Seneca's capital in the mid-1700s. However, if we consider that some of Morgan's details are inaccurate, it's still possible that the actual original story did involve a giant being buried beneath the mound. So we have two spellbinding stories here, one about a giant buried in a mound in Geneva, and another about the remains of one or two giants being found buried in another mound in another part of Geneva. And naturally, these stories don't prove that giants once roamed the land near the northern shore of Seneca Lake. But these stories still have extraordinary value to all of us, inviting us to ponder the possibilities and experience the wonder about our shared, distant past. Well, that's it for this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any thoughts on any of the topics in this episode, please let me know. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss anything. A new podcast comes out every month on the 7s, so I'll talk to you again on the 17th.